The man from Caldwell had been buying turkey from the same 3 farms for 11 years. He was not the kind of man who changed suppliers easily, and everyone in Mercer County knew it. So when his truck turned onto the gravel road off Route 9 that October morning in 1979, and when he climbed out and stood in front of a woman he had never personally vetted, and when he pulled out his checkbook without being asked, the people who heard about it later did not quite believe it at first. They had not been paying attention. Minna Beckett had been paying attention for a very long time. She was 41 years old when she took the land. Not inherited it, not bought it outright. Took it, in the legal sense, in the settlement that ended her marriage to Gerald Whitmore, who had wanted the house in town and the savings account and the truck, and who had not thought much of the 40 acres out past the Hendricks Road fork, the ones with the old turkey barn that hadn't been used since 1962, the ones where the roof on the south side had partially caved in after the ice storm of 1971, the ones that the county assessor had valued at a number that made Gerald's lawyer smile when he read it aloud. Gerald took what he wanted. Minna took what he left. That was the spring of 1974. She was driving a 1966 Ford pickup that she had bought off a man named Schofield for $400, and she loaded that truck with everything she owned that mattered. A cast-iron skillet, a cot, her mother's Bible, 3 boxes of books, a pair of good rubber boots, and a notebook she had bought at the Five and Dime in town the day before she signed the papers. She had not written anything in it yet. She was saving it. The barn was worse than she had remembered. She stood in the doorway the first afternoon and looked at the collapsed section of roof and at the rotted floor joists and at the smell that 17 years of abandonment makes in a building that was once full of large birds, and she thought, well, she thought it for a long time. Then she went back to the truck and got the cast-iron skillet and found 2 dry boards to lay across a section of floor that seemed solid. And she made herself supper, and she slept on the cot. She had 40 acres, a bad barn, and $412 in a checking account that Gerald did not know existed, because she had opened it herself in 1969 with money she had earned doing bookkeeping for the hardware store on weekends, telling Gerald she was visiting her cousin in Beckford. She had been visiting her cousin in Beckford. She had also been keeping books for the hardware store. Gerald had not asked for details. The thing people in Mercer County did not understand, the thing they would not understand for years, was that Minna had not chosen the land by accident. She had chosen it because of the turkeys, not the turkeys that were gone, the turkeys that could come back. But it was a dry July. Her father had kept turkeys on a small place in Wythe County when she was a child, and she had watched him work them, watched how he managed the flock rotation and the feeding schedules, watched how he read the weather and the land together, watched how a man who paid close attention could raise birds on ground that other people would have dismissed as marginal. Her father was not a man who talked much, but he was a man who noticed things, and he had taught her to notice things too, though neither of them would have used that word for it. He would have called it just paying mind. She paid mind. She had been paying mind her whole life, collecting observations the way some women collected recipes, writing nothing down because there had been nowhere private enough to write, until she bought the notebook at the Five and Dime the day before she signed the settlement papers. The first thing she wrote in it was the date, and the condition it was the date and the condition of the barn roof and an estimate of how many board feet of lumber she would need to patch it. The second thing she wrote was a list of what she remembered about turkey behavior in cold weather. The third thing she wrote was a question. How many birds can 40 acres support if managed in rotation? She did not know the answer yet, but she was going to find out. She drove into the town of Coulter on a Saturday in early May, 2 weeks after moving onto the land. She needed supplies, and she needed to ask a question at the feed store, which was run by a man named Purvis, who had known her father slightly, and who was, as far as she could tell, a reasonable person. She was wrong about that last part, or at least partly wrong. Purvis was reasonable enough in the way that many men of his generation were reasonable. He would give you a fair price. He would not cheat you. He would help you if the help you needed was something he recognized as legitimate. What he would not do was take seriously a question that did not come from a source he recognized as legitimate. Minna Beckett, standing on the other side of his counter in her good rubber boots, asking about turkey poult suppliers and pasture rotation stocking rates, was not a source he recognized. He answered her questions, but the way he answered them, the slight delay before each response, the way he glanced toward the 2 men sitting on the bench by the window, the particular quality of patience in his voice, said something that his words did not. It said, "I will answer you because it costs me nothing, but I do not expect this to go anywhere." The 2 men on the bench were not even trying to be subtle. One of them said something to the other behind his hand, and they both laughed, not loudly, just enough. Minna heard it. She wrote down the information Purvis gave her, thanked him, and left. In the truck, she added a note to her notebook. Not about the men, about the stocking rates. She had a number now, and the number meant something. She was back the following Saturday with a list of 6 more questions. Purvis answered all of them. The men on the bench were not there that week. It did not matter whether they were or not. She bought her first poults in June of 1974. 40 bronze-breasted birds from a hatchery 2 counties over, transported in cardboard boxes in the bed of the Ford, with the tailgate down and a piece of screen wire wedged across to keep them from jumping. The hatchery owner helped her load them. He was a quiet man in his 60s, and he did not say anything to suggest he thought the enterprise was foolish, which she appreciated. He also handed her, without being asked, a 3-page mimeographed sheet titled Common Losses in Pastured Turkey Operations and How to Avoid Them, which she read twice in the truck before she drove home and then filed in the back pocket of the notebook. 40 birds. That was the number she could manage alone. She had decided while she was still repairing the barn. Not 60, not 100. 40, because 40 was the number she could watch closely enough to catch problems before they became losses, and because she could not afford to lose very many. She lost 4 in the first 6 weeks. 1 to a fox before she had finished the perimeter fencing on the east pasture. 2 to something she identified, after 2 nights of sitting up with a flashlight, as blackhead disease, which she had read about but not anticipated in ground that had been fallow for 17 years. 1 to what she could only call mystery. A bird that simply stopped eating and was dead by Thursday. She wrote all of it down, the dates, the circumstances, the probable causes, what she had done and what she would do differently. The remaining 36 went to a sale barn in September. She netted, after expenses, $68. Gerald, had he known, would have laughed. She wrote the $68 in the notebook, and then she wrote, "Next year, 60 birds. Improve east perimeter. Address blackhead risk in south quadrant. Negotiate direct with buyers instead of sale barn." She had not yet identified who the buyers would be. That was a problem for the spring. The winter of 1974 into 1975 was the winter she learned the land. She walked every acre of it in November, December, January. Not because she had not walked it before, but because she was walking it differently now, looking for the things you can only see when there is nothing growing. She found where the water moved after heavy rain. She found where the ground stayed wetter longer. She found 2 low spots on the north field that she had not known were there. And she stood in each of them for a long time, thinking. She had read, in a pamphlet from the Agricultural Extension Office she had picked up on one of her trips to town, that turkeys prefer dry, well-drained pasture and are vulnerable to a range of soil-borne conditions in wet ground. She had also read, in a different pamphlet, that rotational grazing of turkeys across a mixed grass and forb pasture could significantly reduce those conditions, if managed correctly. She had read a third thing, in a letter from the extension agent she had started corresponding with, a man named Coleman, who was based in the county seat, and who had, to his credit, responded to her first letter without any of the particular quality of patience that Purvis at the feed store used, that the key variable in rotation was timing, not how often you moved the birds, but when. She spent the winter thinking about when. By February she had drawn a map of the 40 acres in the back of the second notebook. She had filled the first one by December and started a second. The map showed the pasture sections divided into numbered quadrants. Each quadrant had notes, drainage, grass type, proximity to tree line, estimated sun exposure. She drew arrows, showing the rotation sequence she was planning. She drew it 3 different ways before she found the one that made sense. She bought 60 poults in June of 1975. She lost 3. She netted, after expenses, and after selling directly to 2 restaurants in Coulter that she had spent the spring quietly approaching, $431. She wrote it in the notebook. She wrote it in the notebook, then she wrote, "Next year, 100 birds." People in Coulter had started to notice by then, in the way that small towns notice things that confuse them. Minna Beckett, the Whitmore woman, who had taken that worthless piece of land out past Hendricks Road, was apparently still out there, apparently still doing something with turkeys, apparently not yet broke, apparently not yet gone back to her sisters in Roanoke, the way people had assumed she would. The feed store was the main channel for this kind of information, and Purvis, to his credit, did not editorialize much. He simply noted, when asked, that she came in regularly and paid her bills and seemed to know what she was buying. This was, in Purvis's world, about as high a form of praise as you could get without having known someone's father. The men on the bench by the window did not share Purvis's restrained view. There was a rotating cast of them. Different men on different Saturdays, but a consistent type, the kind of men who had been sitting in feed stores and barber shops and filling stations long enough that they had developed strong opinions about what would and would not work, based primarily on what they had seen fail. They had seen a lot of things fail. They had correspondingly strong opinions. Minna was aware of them without paying them much attention, which she knew irritated them more than hostility would have. She bought her supplies, asked her questions, and left. She did not explain herself. She did not ask for their assessment. She did not look toward the bench. What she was thinking about on the drive home from those Saturday trips was usually something specific. A question about the south pasture, a calculation about feed costs, a note she needed to add to the notebook about something she had observed that week that she did not yet have an explanation for. She was not thinking about the men on the bench. She was thinking about the work. The work had its own logic, and she was learning it. Not learning it the way you learn a set of rules that someone has given you. Learning it the way you learn a particular piece of ground, by walking it in every season, by watching what it does, by making note of the things that surprise you, and then not being surprised by them again. The grass doesn't care who's holding the pencil. Piss can care. Piss, she had written in the notebook sometime. During the second winter, it only cares whether you're paying attention. The year 1977 was the year she hired her first help. His name was Decker Ames. He was 19 years old, the younger son of a family who farmed corn about 4 miles down the road, and he had no particular experience with turkeys and no particular investment in whether the enterprise worked or not. He needed work, and she was offering it, and that was the extent of the negotiation. She paid him by the day. He showed up when he said he would, which was the main thing she asked of anyone. She taught him what she knew. Not all at once, and not in any organized way. She was not a natural teacher. She had never thought of herself as one, but in pieces, as situations came up. Here is what to watch for in this section of the pasture when it has rained for 3 days. Here is how the birds behave when they are about to have a problem, before the problem is visible. Here is what the notebooks are for. And here is how you read them. Decker was quiet in the way that young people are sometimes quiet when they are actually paying attention, rather than just waiting for you to stop talking. He asked questions that were specific and practical, and he remembered the answers, which she noted in the way that she noted everything. By the end of the first season, she trusted him with the morning rounds alone. She had 200 birds that year. She lost 11. She sold to 4 restaurants, and 1 wholesale buyer out of Roanoke, a man named Ott who had heard about her from one of the restaurant owners and had driven out in August to look at the operation. He was a careful man. Ott, the kind of buyer who walked the pasture before he agreed to anything, who asked about feed composition and medication records and how she handled losses, who stood in the barn for a long time without saying much. She had brought the notebooks. He looked at them for a long time, too. He offered her a contract for the following year. She read it twice, asked 3 questions, and signed it. That year she netted enough to repair the rest of the barn roof, replace the Ford pickup, and open a savings account. Not Gerald's savings account, her own. She was in the post office, in Coulter, in the fall of 1978, when she heard it. She was not trying to hear it. She was waiting for the woman behind the counter to find a certified letter, and the 2 men standing near the door did not lower their voices, whether because they did not notice her, or because they did not think she warranted the effort. One of them was talking about someone who had tried to run turkeys on pastured ground out near the Garfield Road. The operation had failed, for reasons the man was describing with considerable satisfaction. Wrong breed, wrong drainage, no rotation plan, bought too many birds the first year. The other man listened and then said something that was clearly intended to include her situation in the same category. Something about women who thought that wanting something hard enough was the same as knowing what you were doing. She got her certified letter. She thanked the woman behind the counter. She walked past the 2 men and out the door. In the truck, she sat for a moment. Not because she was upset, exactly. She was something more complicated than upset. She was thinking about the second notebook, the one she had filled in 1975, and the section near the end where she had written out, in detail, exactly how she had addressed the soil drainage problem in the south quadrant, the regrading, the tile work, the change in rotation timing. She was thinking about the 200 birds she had moved through 4 rotations that summer, cleanly, with an 11-bird loss rate that Ott's people had told her was better than most operations twice her size. She was thinking about the notebooks. 5 of them now, stacked in the metal box. She kept on the shelf in the barn office. She did not go back into the post office. She drove home, fed the birds, and wrote in notebook 6. The man at the post office does not know what is in the notebooks, that is not his fault. It is not a problem that requires solving. She underlined the last sentence. 1979 was the year the Caldwell man came. His name was Theodore Greer, and he was the kind of buyer who had built a reputation over 11 years precisely because he did not make decisions quickly. He sourced premium birds for 4 specialty butcher shops in 2 states, and his shops sold at prices that could only be justified by quality so consistent it had become a kind of guarantee. He had never paid for a bird he was not certain of beforehand. This was known. He had heard about Minna Beckett from Ott, who was not a man given to recommendation, and who had said only that her records were the most thorough he had encountered in 20 years of buying, and that her loss rates were notable. Greer had thanked him, and then done nothing for 8 months, because he was not in the habit of chasing things. He had asked around, quietly, in the way that serious buyers ask around, and what he heard had been consistent enough that he finally drove out on a Tuesday in October without calling ahead. She was in the north pasture when she saw his truck come down the gravel road. She did not recognize it. She finished what she was doing, checking the fencing at the corner post, where something had been getting through. And then she walked back to the yard. He introduced himself. He said what he was looking for. He said he had heard she might be someone worth talking to. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Come in." She brought out the notebooks. Not all of them at once. She started with the current one, 1979, and let him look at it as long as he wanted. He asked for the 1977 and 1978 books. She got them. He asked a question about the rotation sequence in 1976, and she went and got that one too. He spent an hour and 40 minutes at her kitchen table, reading, asking questions that were specific and technical, and she answered each one without reference to anything except what she knew, which was considerable. Then he asked to walk the pastures. They walked for an hour. She showed him the rotation system, not explained it, showed it in the way you can only show something that is actually working. She showed him the drainage work on the south quadrant. She showed him the fencing improvements she had made to the east perimeter. She pointed out a section of the north field where she was planning a change to the rotation timing based on what she had observed that summer, and she explained her reasoning. And he listened the way that serious people listen when they are hearing something that confirms something they already suspected. Oh, at the end of the walk, he asked what she could supply for the following year. She told him the number she could commit to reliably, not the number she could theoretically reach if everything went well. She was specific about the difference. He appreciated the distinction. She could see it in the small adjustment of his expression, the almost imperceptible settling that meant he was hearing something he trusted. He pulled out his checkbook. Not to write a check, to have it present, a gesture toward intention. They talked for another 20 minutes. He offered a price per bird. She said she would need $3 more than that. He said he could do 2. She said 2.5, or she would continue with her current buyers, who were reliable. He looked at her for a moment in the way that men who are not used to being countered sometimes look at the person who has done it, not with anger, but with a kind of recalibration. And then he said 2.5 was fair. She had not consulted anyone. She had not asked for his assessment of her operation, which he had clearly expected her to do, or his advice about what she should be raising, or his opinion about whether what she was doing was the right thing. She had given him the notebooks. She had walked him through the land. She had told him what she could do and what it would cost. He shook her hand. He wrote down the figures in a small leather notebook he kept in his breast pocket, which she noticed was about half full. She wondered what kind of records he kept in it. She found out later that he told people she was the most organized operation he had seen in the state. He said her notebooks were better than some extension documentation he had read. He said she knew her ground. The men in Coulter heard about it, of course. Small towns hear about everything eventually, and a buyer of Greer's reputation coming out to the Whitmore place. The Beckett place, she had corrected that herself at the county assessor's office in 1975, legally, quietly, was not something that stayed private long. Purvis at the feed store heard it from Ott's driver. The men on the bench heard it from Purvis, whether he intended that or not. The two men from the post office heard it from whoever heard it first. Word traveled the usual routes. What traveled with it was a particular kind of silence. Not the silence of people who had nothing to say. The silence of people who had said things they now wished they had worded differently, or not said at all. It was a different quality of quiet from the one they had maintained around the subject before, when the quiet had been a form of dismissal. This quiet had weight to it. Minna was not in town when most of this happened. She was in the barn, working. She had 320 birds on the land that fall, organized across 6 rotation quadrants, managed with a system she had refined over 5 seasons and documented across 8 notebooks. Decker was working full-time now, and she had hired his younger cousin part-time for the fall processing season. The Greer contract was signed, and the numbers were better than she had planned for, and she was already thinking about the north 40 acres that adjoined her property, the ones that had come up for sale that summer, the ones with good drainage and the right grass composition, the ones that would let her expand the rotation without overloading the existing pastures. She had not made any decisions about it. Yet, she was watching the numbers and watching the land, and writing things in the notebook, and waiting until she had enough information to think clearly. That was how she worked. It had always been how she worked. She bought the North 40 in 1981. She expanded to 500 birds in 1982. She hired 2 more full-time workers in 1983 and brought Decker in as her operations manager, a title he accepted without ceremony and wore without difficulty because he had been doing the work of it for 2 years already. But it was a dry July. She started teaching at the County Agricultural Extension in 1984, 1 Saturday a month, a session on pasture rotation management for small poultry operations. Coleman, the extension agent she had been writing to since 1975, had asked her twice before she agreed. She was not, she told him, a natural teacher. He said that her records were a form of teaching in themselves, and that she should bring them. She brought the notebooks, all of them by then. 11 stacked in a canvas bag, which she set on the table at the front of the room, and did not open until someone asked a question specific enough to require one. The people who came to those sessions were mostly younger than she was, mostly men, a few women. Some of them had heard of her. Some of them had not. She treated both groups the same way. She answered the questions they asked. She showed them the notebooks when the notebooks were relevant, and she told them, at some point in every session, the same thing she had written in Notebook 2 during the winter of 1975. The land doesn't care who's working it. It only cares whether you're paying attention. She said it in different ways at different sessions, depending on what had come up that day. But the core of it was the same. And the people in those rooms understood what she meant, because most of them had stood on a piece of ground and felt the specific humility of realizing that the ground was older than their opinions about it and would outlast both the opinions and the person holding them. Greer came back every year. He was not the kind of man to let a good source go, and he was not the kind of man to pretend the past had been different from what it was. He had driven out to her land without calling ahead, because he had not been entirely sure what he would find, and what he had found had required him to do a certain amount of quiet adjusting of his own expectations. He did not talk about this, but it was present in the way he dealt with her. A directness that was, she came to understand, a form of respect. He argued about price every year and lost every other one. She had, by 1985, a 12-year record in the notebooks. Not 12 years of unbroken success. 12 years of detailed, specific, honest record of what had worked, what had failed, what she had tried, what she had learned, what she had changed, and what she was still figuring out. The failures were documented as carefully as the successes, maybe more carefully, because the failures were where the useful information lived. Anyone who read the notebooks could see the shape of what she had built, not a straight line upward, but something more like a long process of learning to read a particular piece of ground until the reading became as natural as walking. She closed the notebook she was writing in, number 12, on an evening in November of that year, after the last of the birds were processed, and the barn was cleaned, and Decker had gone home, and the property was quiet in the way that working land is quiet when the day's work is finished. She closed it and set it on the shelf next to the others. 11 notebooks. 12 seasons. 340-some acres. Now, counting the parcel she had bought from the Hendricks estate the previous spring. A contract with Greer that had held for 6 years. An extension teaching record that Coleman had started calling, with some embarrassment, the most attended voluntary session in the county's history. The 40 acres that Gerald had not wanted. She did not think about Gerald very often. When she did, it was not with the particular emotion people might have expected. Not bitterness, not vindication, not satisfaction at some imagined reversal. What she felt, when she thought about it at all, was something quieter than any of those things. She thought about the $412 in the account he had not known about, and the notebook she had bought at the 5 and dime, and the first question she had written in it. How many birds can 40 acres support if managed in rotation? She had answered that question, and then she had answered the next one, and the one after that, and the ones after that, for 12 years, until the answer to each individual question had accumulated into something larger than any single answer, a way of working, a way of knowing, a record of a woman paying close attention to the things she had decided to understand. The work arrives every morning. That has been the lesson. You show up, you pay mind, you write it down, and the ground will eventually tell you what it knows. But only if you have been quiet enough, and patient enough, and honest enough in your records to hear it. She picked up the canvas bag, put the 12 notebooks inside, and turned off the light.